In 1918, construction workers in Kentucky unearthed a metal box containing 17 leather-bound ledgers. Inside, meticulously handwritten entries documented the sale of 637 human bodies to medical schools across America between 1784 and 1821. Each entry concluded with the same chilling phrase, "Coffin weighted appropriately. Family none the wiser." Most disturbing were entries marked with small red crosses, indicating the 418 individuals who weren't already dead when the Ashworth brothers selected them as specimens for their lucrative enterprise. Before I continue with the story of the Ashworth family and their sinister operation at Death Valley Cemetery, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel for more true historical horrors that mainstream historians often overlook. Hit that subscribe button and comment below telling us what state you're listening from. We've heard from listeners in all 50 states who share our passion for uncovering America's darkest secrets. Now let's travel back to the Kentucky wilderness of the late 18th century, where three brothers would transform a peaceful cemetery into the center of an operation that claimed hundreds of lives. In the dense pine forests of eastern Kentucky, there exists a small clearing known as Death Valley. Despite what the cheerful wildflowers might suggest in spring, the name wasn't chosen for its natural beauty. Between 1784 and 1821, this isolated patch of land became the center of perhaps the most disturbing criminal enterprise in early American history, one that claimed over 600 lives and involved a network of respected professionals across 6 states. The full extent of these atrocities remained buried for nearly a century until a chance discovery in 1918 revealed ledgers documenting a methodical operation of murder, deceit, and profiteering orchestrated by three brothers, undertaker Ezekiel Ashworth, gravedigger Mordecai Ashworth, and the community's respected preacher, Zachariah Ashworth. What makes this case particularly chilling is not just the brothers' methodical approach to murder, but how they exploited the sacred trust of a grieving community. When families arrived at Death Valley Cemetery to commit their loved ones to eternal rest, they were unaware that the coffins being lowered into the ground contained nothing but rocks and sand. The actual bodies were being preserved, packaged, and shipped to medical schools across the eastern seaboard, institutions desperate for cadavers and willing to pay extraordinary sums while asking remarkably few questions. The operation continued unchallenged for decades, expanding from opportunistic grave robbery to calculated murder as demand from medical colleges grew. The brothers developed a method for identifying ideal victims, typically solitary travelers passing through Kentucky's remote eastern counties, those without family connections who wouldn't be missed. The final ledger entries suggest the operation had grown to involve dozens of accomplices, including physicians, university professors, and even government officials who profited from this macabre trade. This dark chapter of American history was nearly lost forever, until a widow named Elizabeth Caldwell began asking questions about her husband's suspiciously light coffin in the autumn of 1821, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the full horror of what transpired at Death Valley Cemetery. The settlement that would later be known as Ashworth Creek began as little more than a collection of cabins nestled in eastern Kentucky's dense forests, about 50 miles from the Virginia border. By 1784, it had grown to include approximately 40 families, most having migrated from Virginia and North Carolina seeking fertile land and fresh opportunities in the wake of the Revolutionary War. The community was primarily Baptist, with a strong streak of independence typical of frontier settlements. The nearest large town was nearly 2 days' journey by horse, leaving Ashworth Creek largely isolated, especially during winter months when mountain passes became impassable. The Ashworth brothers arrived in the spring of 1784, presenting themselves as men of ambition and capability at a time when the growing settlement desperately needed both. Ezekiel, the eldest at 32, brought experience as an undertaker from Philadelphia. Mordecai, 2 years younger, was a skilled carpenter who quickly established himself as the settlement's gravedigger and coffin maker. Zachariah, the youngest at 27, was perhaps the most immediately valuable to the community, a Baptist preacher with formal training from a seminary in Virginia, a rarity in these remote parts. Within 6 months of their arrival, the brothers had established Death Valley Cemetery on a 5-acre plot of land they purchased at the eastern edge of the settlement. The name, Zechariah explained to the community, was a biblical reference, the Valley of the Shadow of Death from Psalms, rather than a morbid choice. The location was ideal, elevated enough to avoid flooding, yet with soil soft enough for easy digging. More importantly for the brothers' undisclosed purposes, it was situated near a seldom-used trade route that connected to larger roads leading toward Virginia, Pennsylvania, and points further east. The centerpiece of the cemetery was a small white chapel where Zechariah held Sunday services and funeral ceremonies. Behind it stood a long, low building that served as Ezekiel's undertaking establishment, where he prepared bodies for burial. Adjacent to this was Mordecai's workshop, where he crafted coffins of varying quality to suit the financial means of the deceased's family. The brothers lived together in a 2-story home at the edge of the property, separated from the cemetery by a grove of pine trees. The community quickly came to respect the Ashworth brothers. Ezekiel projected a solemn dignity appropriate to his profession. His meticulous attention to detail in preparing the dead for viewing brought comfort to grieving families. Mordecai was more reserved, often appearing uncomfortable in social settings. But his craftsmanship was beyond reproach. His coffins were known for their quality, with precisely fitted joints and smooth finishes, even on the most basic models. It was Zechariah, however, who truly captured the community's trust and admiration. Handsome and charismatic, he delivered powerful sermons that resonated with the frontier congregation. He had a remarkable ability to comfort the bereaved, offering words that somehow made the loss more bearable. His prayers over fresh graves often moved even the most stoic settlers to tears. Children were particularly drawn to him, following him around the settlement as he made his pastoral visits. The Reverend has God's own gift for easing suffering, Martha Tunney remarked after Zechariah officiated her husband's funeral in the winter of 1785. I don't know how we'd manage death in this wilderness without the Ashworths to guide us through it. What nobody in Ashworth Creek realized was that the brothers had specifically selected their community after careful research. They had spent nearly a year traveling through frontier settlements before choosing this location for its isolation, its growing population, and critically, its position relative to the expanding medical education system in America's eastern cities. The late 18th century marked the beginning of formal medical education in the United States. Medical schools were being established in Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and Boston, all facing the same critical shortage: human cadavers for anatomical study. Laws severely restricted access to bodies for dissection, typically limiting medical schools to the corpses of executed criminals. This supply fell dramatically short of demand, creating a black market where a fresh, well-preserved body could command extraordinary prices. The Ashworths were uniquely positioned to capitalize on this demand. Ezekiel had worked as an assistant at Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, where he had made connections with physicians desperate for anatomical specimens. Mordecai had developed preservation techniques during his previous employment with a shipping company that transported goods through varying climates. Zechariah's religious credentials provided the perfect cover for their operation, lending an unquestioned legitimacy to their handling of the dead. "We provide a service to the living and the dead," Ezekiel wrote in the first entry of his ledger, dated June 17, 1784. The deceased serve the advancement of medical knowledge, while their families receive the comfort of proper burial rites. That the families believe they are burying their loved ones is a mercy. They need never know the higher purpose their departed now serve. The brothers' operation began modestly. When a death occurred in the community, the family would naturally call upon the Ashworths. Ezekiel would collect the body, promise to prepare it for a viewing, and bring it to his establishment. There, he would carefully examine the corpse, assessing its suitability for anatomical study. Bodies of those who had died from contagious disease were typically deemed unsuitable, as were those in advanced states of decomposition. For bodies Ezekiel considered valuable, the brothers implemented their deception. After the family had viewed their loved one, arranged peacefully in an open coffin, face visible but body covered with a burial shroud, Ezekiel would excuse them, explaining that he needed to perform final preparations before sealing the coffin. Once alone, he would remove the body to a concealed cellar beneath the preparation room, accessed through a trapdoor hidden under a heavy work table. In the cellar, Ezekiel would begin preservation procedures, typically injecting a solution of alcohol, salt, and various herbs into the major blood vessels. The body would then be packed in a mixture of salt and sawdust inside a specially constructed shipping container, narrow wooden crates that Mordecai built to resemble tool chests. Meanwhile, Mordecai would fill the coffin with rocks, sand, and in winter, frozen soil, carefully distributed to approximate human weight. The coffin would be sealed permanently, ready for the funeral service. Zechariah would perform a moving ceremony, speaking eloquently about resurrection and eternal peace, while the family remained unaware that their loved one's body lay not in the coffin but in the brothers' cellar, awaiting transport. The early ledger entries show a cautious approach. In their first year, the brothers shipped only 8 bodies to contacts at medical schools in Philadelphia and New York. Payments were substantial, between $17 and $25 per body, at a time when a skilled laborer might earn $1 per day. The money was delivered through an arrangement with traveling merchants who served as unwitting couriers, carrying sealed packets they believed contained business correspondence. Received payment for subject number 8 today. Ezekiel wrote in April 1785, $23. Our best price yet. Dr. H. at Pennsylvania Medical College specifically requested more specimens showing healed bone fractures. Must keep watch for appropriate subjects. By 1787, the operation had proven successful enough that the brothers expanded their cemetery, purchasing adjacent land and extending the road that connected to the main trade route. They also began to range further in their services, offering to collect and prepare bodies from settlements up to 20 miles away. This expansion allowed them to increase their shipments to 15 bodies that year. The isolation that made this community appealing now constrains our enterprise, Ezekiel noted in his ledger. Zechariah suggests we must widen our reach. Mordecai has designed an improved preservation method that should allow bodies to remain suitable for study even after 2 weeks' transport. The cemetery itself became a source of community pride. The Ashworths maintained it meticulously, with neat rows of graves marked by increasingly elaborate headstones that Mordecai carved himself. Twice yearly, Zechariah would organize community gatherings to clean the grounds, plant flowers, and repair any damage from weather. These events typically concluded with a picnic on the cemetery grounds, a practice that would seem macabre to outsiders, but reflected the frontier community's practical relationship with death. No one questioned why the Ashworths would occasionally disappear for several days, explaining that they were visiting suppliers in larger towns or attending to family matters in Virginia. In reality, these trips were for delivering bodies to their medical contacts or meeting with new potential buyers. As the operation continued, the brothers developed a system of communication with their clients using coded letters exchanged through a network of post riders. The codes referred to bodies as study materials and used agricultural terminology to describe their condition and characteristics. Fresh bodies were green harvests, while preserved specimens were cured crops. Specific anatomical features of interest were described using lumber terminology. Specimens with knots referred to bodies with tumors or unusual growths, while straight grain indicated individuals with standard anatomy ideal for teaching. Basic structure. By 1790, the business had become so profitable that the brothers were among the wealthiest residents of the growing settlement, though they lived modestly to avoid attracting attention to their sudden prosperity. They invested much of their profits in land throughout eastern Kentucky, establishing themselves as significant property owners. This financial success allowed them to improve their facilities, including the construction of a larger cellar with improved ventilation and drainage, and a hidden rear exit from their property that allowed for discreet movement of bodies to waiting wagons. The community continued to view the Ashworths with respect and gratitude, unaware of the grim commerce taking place literally beneath their feet as they mourned at funerals or attended Sunday services. The brothers had created a perfect facade, becoming indispensable to a community that had no reason to question what happened after they entrusted their dead to the Ashworth's care. As the dawn broke on October 17, 1791, a significant shift occurred in the Ashworth operation, one that would transform them from opportunistic body snatchers to calculated murderers. The catalyst was a letter from Dr. William Hammond of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, delivered by a merchant passing through the area. "Our need for fresh specimens has become desperate," the doctor wrote in coded language. "The current legislation has further restricted access to traditional sources. We are prepared to offer $40 per suitable subject, with bonuses for specimens of particular educational value. The advancement of American medicine depends on institutions like yours that understand the necessities that transcend common sensibilities." Ezekiel recorded his thoughts on this development in his ledger that evening. $40 per subject changes our calculations entirely. At such rates, we need not wait for death to visit Ashworth Creek naturally. There are travelers on the Western Road who would not be missed, solitary men seeking opportunity in the territories. Providence delivers them to our doorstep. It would be foolish to ignore such opportunity. The brothers' first intentional victim was a nameless traveler who sought shelter at the cemetery's chapel during an autumn storm. Zachariah offered the man hospitality, inviting him to dinner at the brothers' home. The meal included wine laced with a potent mixture of herbs that Ezekiel had learned about during his hospital employment, a combination that caused rapid unconsciousness followed by respiratory failure that mimicked natural death. Subject number 73, Ezekiel wrote clinically. Male, approximately 30 years, robust physique with interesting surgical scar across abdomen. No identification found. Administered the solution at dinner. Effect was swift and appeared painless. Preservation. Begun within the hour. Should fetch premium price from Dr. Hammond, who specifically requested surgical specimens. This marked the beginning of a methodical campaign of murder. The brothers developed criteria for selecting victims who would be least likely to be missed or searched for. They targeted solitary travelers, particularly those who appeared to be moving westward with no specific destination. Men seeking new opportunities on the frontier were unlikely to have left detailed plans of their movements with family or authorities. Ashworths created a system to identify potential victims. Zachariah would engage travelers in conversation, asking pointed questions about their backgrounds and destinations, assessing whether they had connections who might come looking for them. Ezekiel kept watch at the crossroads, noting which travelers moved alone and appeared to carry valuables that could be taken to suggest robbery as a motive if a body was discovered. Mordecai modified the cellar to include 3 separate chambers, allowing them to process multiple victims simultaneously during busy travel seasons. The brothers refined their killing methods as well. The herbal mixture evolved to include ingredients that would break down quickly in the body, leaving little trace even if an examination were conducted. They developed techniques for disposing of victims' possessions, typically burning papers and selling or trading valuables in distant towns during their delivery trips. By 1795, the ledgers show the operation had expanded dramatically. That year alone, they shipped 28 bodies to medical schools, 19 of which were obtained through murder rather than natural deaths in the community. The financial rewards were substantial, over $1,100 in that year alone, equivalent to more than $23,000 in today's currency. The operation might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the brothers' growing ambition and the changing landscape of American medical education. As more medical schools opened across the eastern seaboard, demand for cadavers increased exponentially. The brothers expanded their network of buyers to include schools in Baltimore, Richmond, and as far north as Boston. With this expansion came greater risks. More frequent shipments increased the possibility of discovery during transport. The brothers addressed this by developing more elaborate preservation techniques and constructing false-bottomed wagons for transporting bodies. They also began to cultivate relationships with stagecoach drivers and merchants who regularly traveled east, paying them to transport special medical supplies without asking questions about the contents. Perhaps most significantly, the brothers began to establish connections with physicians and medical professors who were fully aware of the illegal nature of their business. These professionals, desperate for anatomical specimens to advance their research and teaching, were willing to pay premium prices and provide protection through their connections with local authorities. Dr. M. from Baltimore College has proven particularly valuable. Ezekiel wrote in 1797, "His cousin serves as magistrate in Harford County and ensures our wagons pass without inspection. In exchange, we provide him with 2 specimens monthly, with emphasis on female subjects, which he claims are underrepresented in their teaching collection." The demand for specific types of specimens led the brothers to become more targeted in their murders. Medical schools would request bodies with particular characteristics: young men with muscular development, elderly subjects with signs of disease, women of childbearing age, or children with congenital abnormalities. The Ashworths obliged, selecting victims to match these specifications whenever possible. This growing network of complicit professionals is documented in the final ledger, which contains a list of 43 doctors, professors, and officials who knowingly participated in the enterprise. These included not only medical faculty, but also sheriffs, judges, and even 2 state legislators who provided protection and facilitated transportation across state lines in exchange for payments or guaranteed access to specimens for their affiliated institutions. The summer of 1800 marked another evolution in the brothers' operation. Zachariah, whose role had primarily been maintaining their respected position in the community, began traveling to nearby settlements to preach as a visiting minister. These trips served a dual purpose: identifying potential victims in other communities and establishing the brothers' presence across a wider area, making their frequent travels less suspicious. During these journeys, Zachariah would identify individuals who fit their criteria, often the elderly or infirm who lived alone, or recent arrivals to communities who had not yet established strong local connections. He would then return with Ezekiel, presenting him as a doctor with special treatments unavailable locally. For those who accepted their help, the treatment invariably included medicines laced with their lethal mixture. Acquired 3 subjects from Logan Creek this month, noted Ezekiel in August 1801. Zachariah's position as a man of God continues to open doors that would otherwise remain closed. People trust a preacher who brings a doctor to their sickbed. Their faith is touching, if misplaced. The brothers became bolder with their murders as time passed, occasionally targeting individuals who were more integrated into communities when specific specimen types commanded extraordinary prices. In these cases, they were careful to create circumstances that appeared natural or accidental, illness that worsened despite treatment, falls from horses, or drownings in creeks. The scale of their operation grew to disturbing proportions. Between 1800 and 1810, the ledgers document the shipment of 217 bodies, an average of nearly 2 per month. The majority were murder victims rather than natural deaths from Ashworth Creek. The brothers had essentially established a production line of death, with Zachariah identifying victims, Ezekiel administering the fatal preparations, and Mordecai handling preservation and transport. What makes this period particularly chilling is how the community's trust in the Ashworths only deepened. Zachariah's congregation grew, with people traveling from miles around to hear his increasingly powerful sermons on mortality and divine judgment. Ezekiel was called upon to advise neighboring settlements on establishing their own cemeteries. Mordecai's coffins were in such demand that he trained 2 apprentices to keep pace, though these young men were never made aware of the brothers' true business. 20 years in this community, Zechariah wrote in a rare personal entry in Ezekiel's ledger in 1804, and they looked to us for guidance on how to die well. If they only knew we had become the most practiced shepherds of souls to the afterlife in all of Kentucky. Even as their enterprise flourished, there were occasional moments of peril. In the spring of 1805, a traveling merchant noticed a peculiar smell coming from one of the crates he had been paid to transport to Richmond. When he mentioned this to Mordecai, he was invited to dinner at the brothers' home. The merchant was never seen again, and appears in the ledger as subject number 283 in 1807. A new doctor attempted to establish a practice in Ashworth Creek. Dr. Thomas Bennett, trained in Philadelphia, quickly developed suspicions about the unusually high mortality rate among travelers in the area. When he began asking questions about recent deaths, the brothers recognized the threat he posed. Within 3 months of his arrival, Dr. Bennett died suddenly of what Zachariah solemnly announced was brain fever. His body was quickly buried, one of the few occasions when an Ashworth victim was actually interred in Death Valley Cemetery, rather than shipped east dock. Despite these close calls, the brothers' confidence in their operation grew, perhaps excessively so. By 1810, they had expanded their network to include middlemen in Lexington and Louisville who facilitated connections with medical schools throughout the eastern United States. These intermediaries increased the brothers' reach but also introduced new vulnerabilities, more people who knew at least portions of their secret. The ledgers from this period show an increasing sophistication in their business operations. They began categorizing bodies based on quality and characteristics, with pricing tiers that reflected the specimen's educational value. Bodies of individuals who had died from interesting diseases or with unusual anatomical features commanded premium prices, sometimes exceeding $100, an extraordinary sum at the time. The brothers also began accepting special requests for specific specimens, essentially taking orders from medical professors seeking particular examples for their teaching. Entries from 1812 include notations such as subject secured to fulfill Dr. G's request for advanced tuberculosis example, and female subject, aged approximately 20, with childbearing characteristics as requested by Medical College of Virginia. As the War of 1812 disrupted normal trade patterns, the brothers adapted their operation, sometimes storing bodies for longer periods using improved preservation techniques Ezekiel had developed. They also found that the wartime demand for medical personnel created new opportunities, as hastily trained army surgeons sought additional anatomical study whenever possible. By 1815, as America entered its post-war expansion, the Ashworths had amassed considerable wealth. While they maintained modest appearances in Ashworth Creek, they had purchased extensive properties throughout Kentucky through proxies and invested in various business ventures in Lexington and Louisville. The ledger suggests their total earnings from the body trade exceeded $25,000, A fortune in early 19th century America. The years between 1815 and 1820 marked the peak of the Ashworth's operation. With their network firmly established and their methods refined through decades of practice, they shipped an average of 36 bodies annually to medical schools across the eastern United States. Their preservation techniques had become so advanced that bodies could remain suitable for dissection even after weeks of transport, allowing them to serve clients as far away as Boston and Charleston. What the brothers failed to recognize, however, was that the changing landscape of America was beginning to work against them. Improved transportation networks meant more frequent travel through previously isolated areas. New settlements were establishing their own services, reducing dependence on central locations like Ashworth Creek. Most significantly, communication between communities was becoming more reliable, making the disappearance of travelers more likely to be noticed and investigated. That, if you've been captivated by the dark tale of the Ashworth brothers so far, you're not alone. This is the kind of historical horror that continues to send chills down the spines of those brave enough to look into America's shadowy past. Take a moment to hit that like button if you're finding this story as disturbing as our research team did when uncovering these forgotten records. And if you haven't already subscribed, do it now. Our channel brings you America's most terrifying true historical cases that mainstream historians often overlook. Now, let's return to eastern Kentucky in 1820, where the Ashworth's murderous enterprise was about to face an unexpected challenge. The first significant threat to the brothers' operation came in the autumn of 1820, when James Caldwell, a prosperous farmer from central Kentucky, passed through Ashworth Creek on his way to visit relatives in Virginia. Caldwell stopped to attend Sunday service at the cemetery chapel, where he was warmly welcomed by Zachariah. After the service, he mentioned his journey to Zachariah, explaining that he would be returning in approximately 2 weeks. Ezekiel's ledger entry for September 24, 1820, reads, "Potential subject presented himself today. J. Caldwell, traveling alone to Virginia, plans return journey in 2 weeks. Well-dressed, approximately 45 years, excellent physical condition." Zachariah suggests we wait for his return journey, when his absence would be attributed to the dangers of the Virginia Road rather than our community. When Caldwell returned through Ashworth Creek on October 9th, he again attended service at the Palaka Chapel. Afterward, Zachariah invited him to dine at the brothers' home before continuing his journey. Caldwell accepted, becoming the brothers' 623rd victim. What the Ashworths could not have known was that Caldwell had recently married Elizabeth Harmon, a widow 20 years his junior, who expected his return to their farm near Lexington by October 15th, when Caldwell failed to appear. Elizabeth began making inquiries about his journey. Unlike many victims' families who accepted vague reports of travelers meeting with accidents or illness on the frontier, Elizabeth Caldwell was persistent and methodical. She traced her husband's planned route, sending letters to postmasters in each town he would have passed through. In early November, she received confirmation that James had been seen in Ashworth Creek on October 9th, attending service at the cemetery chapel. Elizabeth arrived in Ashworth Creek on November 20th, 1820, introducing herself to Zachariah and inquiring about her husband. The preacher expressed sympathy and confirmed that James had indeed attended service and shared a meal with the brothers before departing eastward around dusk. "I remember your husband well," Zachariah told her. "A good Christian man who spoke fondly of his new wife. We were concerned about him traveling so late, but he was determined to make significant progress before nightfall." Elizabeth might have accepted this explanation had she not noticed Mordecai's reaction when she entered the chapel. The middle brother, typically reserved, had visibly paled upon hearing her introduce herself as James Caldwell's wife. This subtle reaction planted a seed of suspicion that would ultimately lead to the brothers' downfall. Instead of continuing her journey, Elizabeth took a room at the small inn in Ashworth Creek, explaining that she wanted to speak with anyone who might have seen her husband. Over the next several days, she became a familiar figure in the settlement, asking careful questions and noting the answers in a small journal she carried. Ezekiel's ledger reflects growing concern. Mrs. Caldwell remains in the settlement, asking questions about her husband's passage through the area. Zachariah has spoken with her several times, providing consistent details about J. Caldwell's departure. Mordecai's unease in her presence is problematic. Have instructed him to avoid the woman entirely. What troubled Elizabeth most was a detail she discovered during her investigation. A young boy who had been playing near the cemetery road on the evening of October 9th mentioned seeing Mr. Caldwell's distinctive chestnut horse tied behind the Ashworth's home well after dark, contradicting Zachariah's account of his departure. Before nightfall, when confronted with this discrepancy, Zachariah smoothly explained that James had indeed started his journey but returned briefly when he realized he had forgotten his gloves at the brothers' home. This explanation might have satisfied many, but Elizabeth noted that her husband was meticulous about his possessions and had specially commissioned gloves that he kept securely in his saddlebags while traveling. On November 28th, Elizabeth visited the local magistrate, expressing her suspicions and requesting that he investigate the Ashworths. The magistrate, Jacob Turner, was initially dismissive, reluctant to question the respected brothers based on what seemed circumstantial concerns from a worried wife. However, Elizabeth's persistence and the detailed nature of her inquiries eventually persuaded him to make at least a cursory investigation. Turner visited the Ashworth home the following day, ostensibly to discuss plans for expanding the cemetery. During this conversation, he casually mentioned Elizabeth Caldwell's presence in town and her concerns about her husband. The brothers maintained their composure, though Ezekiel's ledger entry that evening reveals their private reaction. Magistrate Turner's visit signals potential danger. Mrs. Caldwell has involved local authority, though Turner himself seems unconvinced of any wrongdoing. Must accelerate current shipment preparation and temporarily suspend acquisition of new subjects. Zachariah suggests a controlled fire in the storage cellar might be necessary if the situation deteriorates. The situation might still have resolved in the brothers' favor had Elizabeth not taken the extraordinary step of insisting that her husband would have wanted to be buried in the family plot if he had died during his journey. She requested that Turner issue a letter she could carry, asking any community where her husband might have perished to exhume his body for transport back to Lexington. This request gave her a pretext for inquiring about recent burials in communities along her husband's route. It also planted the idea that became her next investigative step. On December 3rd, Elizabeth asked Zachariah a direct question. If her husband had died on his return journey, how would the Ashworths have conducted his funeral as the settlements? Only religious and burial specialists? Zachariah, ever smooth, described the brothers' typical procedures for travelers who perished in the area. We would prepare the body with dignity, hold a simple service in the chapel, and provide a marked grave in the traveler section of our cemetery. Your husband would have received God's full measure of respect in our care, Mrs. Caldwell. Elizabeth thanked him and departed, but returned the next morning with Magistrate Turner and a request that struck at the heart of the brothers' deception. I've had a troubling dream of my husband calling to me from this place, she told Turner in Zachariah's presence. For my peace of mind, I wish to have recent traveler graves opened to assure myself he is not here, misidentified perhaps, or buried without my knowledge. The brothers now faced a serious dilemma. Their typical practice involved fake burials, with weighted coffins for community members whose bodies were shipped east. However, for travelers they murdered, they rarely performed actual burials, instead processing the bodies immediately for preservation and transport. There were no graves that could be opened to satisfy Elizabeth's request without revealing their Scheme. Ezekiel attempted to dissuade Turner, citing religious impropriety and potential health concerns from disturbing the dead. Zechariah suggested that such an action might invite divine displeasure. Mordecai, breaking his usual silence, argued that the ground was too frozen for such work. Turner might have been convinced by these objections, but Elizabeth had carefully cultivated relationships with several community members during her stay. When word of her request spread, support came from an unexpected quarter. Martha Tunney, whose husband had been among the first buried by the Ashworths in 1785, spoke up at a community gathering. "If it would ease the poor woman's heart to know her husband isn't buried unrecognized in our ground, Christian charity demands we help her," Martha declared. "I would want the same comfort were I searching for my Henry in strange territory." Faced with community sentiment and Elizabeth's unwavering persistence, Turner reluctantly ordered the examination of 3 recent graves in the travelers section of the cemetery. The brothers had no choice but to comply, though Ezekiel's ledger reveals their behind-the-scenes scramble. Disaster looms. Turner has ordered grave examinations for tomorrow morning. We have no actual travelers buried in the marked plots. Mordecai suggests we disinter a community member buried last year and place in one of the traveler graves tonight, but identification would be impossible after our preservation process. Our only course is to allow the examination and claim confusion about grave markers. Must prepare for potential flight if suspicions intensify. On the morning of December 7, 1821, Turner, Elizabeth, and several community members gathered at Death Valley Cemetery. Mordecai and 2 assistants began excavating the first grave, marked with the name Jonathan Wiley, d. September 1820. After an hour of digging, they reached the coffin, which Mordecai opened with visible reluctance. The crowd gasped when the coffin was revealed to contain not a body, but a carefully arranged assortment of rocks and soil wrapped in burial linens to approximate a human form. Elizabeth immediately demanded the other graves be opened, and by midday, all 3 had revealed the same deception: weighted coffins with no human remains. "What is the meaning of this?" Turner demanded, his former respect for the Ashworths visibly shaken. "Where are the bodies of these travelers?" Zechariah, attempting to salvage the situation, claimed ignorance, suggesting that grave robbers must have stolen the bodies for unknown purposes. This explanation might have seemed plausible in larger cities, where body snatching for medical schools was a known problem, but in isolated Ashworth Creek, with no nearby medical facilities, the excuse rang hollow. "If grave robbers took these bodies," Elizabeth asked pointedly, "why would they refill the coffins with rocks and rebury them? And how could they do so without anyone in the settlement noticing such extensive digging?" The crowd's murmuring suggested growing suspicion. Turner ordered the brothers confined to their home while he considered next steps. He posted 2 armed men at their door, more to protect them from potentially angry community members than to prevent escape. That night, while under this loose guard, the brothers made their decision. Ezekiel's final ledger entry reads, "All is lost. The woman's persistence has undone decades of work. We have prepared for this contingency and will implement our escape plan tonight. Essential records and accumulated funds are secured in the designated location. God's work, as we have defined it, must continue elsewhere." What followed was perhaps the most damning evidence of the brothers' guilt. Rather than face questioning, they set fire to their home, creating a diversion that allowed them to flee into the winter night. By the time the community organized to battle the blaze, the Ashworths had vanished, taking with them a wagon and supplies prepared for just such an emergency. The fire, intended to destroy evidence, instead revealed the full horror of their enterprise. As flames spread to the undertaking establishment, community members working to contain the blaze discovered the hidden trapdoor leading to the brothers' secret cellar. What they found below would haunt the settlement for generations. 3 chambers had been carved from the Kentucky clay. The first contained specialized tools for dissection and preservation, along with chemicals unknown to the local population. The second chamber held 5 bodies in various stages of preservation, including that of James Caldwell, identifiable by the distinctive gold ring still on his finger, the wedding band Elizabeth had described in her inquiries. The third chamber, however, contained the most disturbing discovery: 16 leather-bound ledgers documenting nearly 4 decades of the brothers' macabre trade. These meticulous records, which Ezekiel had apparently deemed too valuable to destroy or take in their hasty escape, provided irrefutable evidence of their crimes and the extensive network that had facilitated them. "I knew my husband was here," Elizabeth Caldwell said quietly as she identified James's body. "A wife knows when she's being lied to about the man she loves." Turner, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the discovery, dispatched riders to the nearest larger settlements seeking assistance from county and state authorities. Within days, officials from Lexington arrived to begin a formal investigation, bringing with them a physician who confirmed that the preservation methods used on the bodies matched those commonly employed by medical schools. As news of the discovery spread, communities throughout eastern Kentucky began questioning deaths and burials the Ashworths had handled. The investigation expanded as officials attempted to match ledger entries with missing persons reports and unmarked graves. The final death toll, attributed to the brothers, 637 victims over 37 years, made them perhaps the most prolific murderers in American history to that point. The scope of the conspiracy revealed in the ledgers sent shockwaves through the medical establishment. The final volume contained the names of 43 physicians, medical professors, and officials who had knowingly participated in the enterprise. Some had simply purchased cadavers without asking questions about their source, but others had actively facilitated the brothers' operation, providing protection from authorities and placing specific orders for bodies with particular characteristics. It appears the Ashworths were merely the most visible portion of a vast criminal enterprise stretching across 6 states, wrote Judge William Harrison, who oversaw the subsequent investigation. The demand from our medical institutions for anatomical specimens created an incentive for murder on an industrial scale, with respected professionals choosing to ignore the obvious ethical questions their purchases should have raised. If you've been following the Ashworth family's horrific tale so far, you've barely scratched the surface of one of early America's most disturbing criminal enterprises. Our research team has uncovered details that historians have overlooked for centuries. Show your support by hitting that like button and leaving a comment about what aspects of this dark history you find most chilling. For those brave souls who want more historical horror stories that mainstream historians won't touch, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Let's continue with the aftermath of the Ashworth brothers. Shocking crimes. The investigation into the Ashworth brothers' crimes continued for nearly 2 years, becoming one of the most extensive criminal inquiries of early 19th century America. Officials faced extraordinary challenges in documenting the full extent of the brothers' activities, particularly in identifying victims and notifying their families. Many of the Ashworths' victims were travelers without strong connections to communities, making identification nearly impossible decades after their disappearances. Officials made the difficult decision to reinter unidentified remains in a mass grave at the edge of what had been Death Valley Cemetery, marked with a simple stone that read, "Here lie the victims of man's inhumanity to man, 1784 to 1821. For the families who could identify their loved ones, the discoveries were devastating. Martha Tunney, who had spoken so movingly of her husband Henry's funeral conducted by the Ashworths in 1785, learned that his body had never been buried in Death Valley Cemetery. According to the ledgers, he had been the brothers' 7th shipment, sent to a medical college in Philadelphia 2 days after his funeral service. "For 36 years, I've brought flowers to an empty grave," Martha told the Lexington Gazette in 1822, "I've spoken to Henry there," believing his remains were listening from beneath the soil, to learn that strangers have cut apart his body hundreds of miles away. There are no words for such a violation. The investigation into the medical professionals implicated in the ledgers proved equally challenging. Many of the earliest collaborators had died by the time of discovery. Others used their considerable influence to avoid prosecution. Several fled to Europe when news of the investigation became public. In the end, only 11 of the 43 named individuals faced formal charges, and just 4 were convicted, all receiving relatively light sentences compared to the magnitude of their involvement. Dr. William Hammond of Jefferson Medical College, whose 1791 letter had encouraged the brothers to begin murdering travelers, was among those who escaped justice. By the time investigators tracked him to Baltimore in 1823, he had boarded a ship for England, never to return to American shores. The Ashworth brothers themselves vanished into the expanding American frontier. Despite one of the most extensive manhunts of the era, with descriptions circulated throughout the United States and into Canada, no confirmed sightings were ever documented. Rumors occasionally surfaced. 3 brothers matching their description operating a small church in Missouri in 1824. An undertaker named Ashfield in western Pennsylvania, whose preservation techniques matched Ezekiel's methods. A traveling preacher in Tennessee who resembled Zechariah, but called himself Thomas Blackwood. It is a disturbing possibility that the Ashworths, having perfected their deception over decades, may have simply established themselves elsewhere, under new identities. Judge Harrison wrote in his final report on the case in 1825, "Men capable of maintaining such a facade of respectability while committing unspeakable crimes would find little difficulty in creating new personas on the frontier, where questions about one's past are considered impolite at best." The case had profound impacts on American medicine and burial practices. Medical schools faced increased scrutiny and regulation regarding their acquisition of anatomical specimens. Several states passed legislation specifically criminalizing the sale and purchase of bodies for dissection outside narrow legal channels, though the persistent shortage of cadavers meant that a black market continued to exist well into the 20th century. Communities throughout the Appalachian region developed new customs to ensure their dead were actually buried as intended. These included multi-day wakes where the body was never left unattended, burial societies whose members personally oversaw every aspect of interment, and in some areas the practice of sitting up with the dead, where community members would maintain a vigil at the grave for several days after burial to prevent disturbance. The settlement of Ashworth Creek, tainted by its association with the brothers' crimes, officially changed its name to Providence in 1823. Death Valley Cemetery was deconsecrated, with most families choosing to exhume their loved ones' coffins, finding, in almost every case, that they contained only rocks and soil rather than human remains. The cemetery grounds were eventually abandoned and reclaimed by the forest, with only the mass grave marker remaining visible by the mid-19th century. The psychological impact on the community was perhaps the most profound and lasting effect. People who had trusted the Ashworths completely, had wept with Zechariah at funerals, had clasped Ezekiel's hand in gratitude for his careful preparation of loved ones, had admired Mordecai's craftsmanship, now questioned their ability to judge character at all. "We invited wolves into our fold and called them shepherds," wrote Rebecca Lansing, a longtime resident of the settlement, in a letter to her sister in Virginia. "We gave them our dead to tend and never questioned when they grew prosperous from such somber work." What does it say about our discernment that men capable of such calculating evil were our most respected citizens for nearly 40 years? The case gradually faded from public consciousness as the 19th century progressed. Occasional newspaper articles would revisit the Kentucky body merchants on anniversaries of the discovery, but the full details were considered too gruesome for Victorian sensibilities. By the early 20th century, the Ashworth case had become little more than a footnote in criminal history, occasionally mentioned in medical ethics discussions but largely forgotten by the general public. This might have remained the case had construction workers not unearthed a metal box while excavating for a new road near Somerset, Kentucky, in 1918. Inside were 17 leather-bound ledgers, the original 16 from the brothers' cellar, which had been held as evidence during the investigation, plus a 17th volume that had never been found during the initial discovery. This final ledger, apparently hidden separately from the others, contained the brothers' contingency plans, including detailed maps to caches of money buried throughout eastern Kentucky and a coded list of contacts who had agreed to help them establish new identities if their operation was discovered. Most disturbingly, it included Ezekiel's reflections on their decades of murder, revealing a man who viewed his crimes not with remorse, but with clinical pride in the efficiency of their operation. "We have advanced medical knowledge more than any physicians of our era," he wrote in an entry dated July 1821, just months before their discovery. "The bodies we have provided have trained hundreds of doctors who would otherwise have practiced with inadequate anatomical understanding. If each of these physicians saves even a handful of patients due to their superior training, our work has saved more lives than the number we have taken. History, should it ever judge us, must consider this calculus." The discovery of these additional records sparked renewed interest in the case. The ledgers were transferred to the Kentucky Historical Society, where researchers began the painstaking process of analyzing their contents using modern investigative techniques unavailable to 19th century officials. This research revealed dimensions of the case that had gone undetected during the original investigation. The brothers' network had been even more extensive than initially believed. The ledgers documented connections with anatomists in Europe, with several shipments sent to medical schools in Edinburgh and Paris via trusted sea captains who asked no questions about the research materials transported. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Modern economic analysis of the recorded payments suggests the brothers had earned the equivalent of over $4 million in today's currency through their body trafficking enterprise. Most of this wealth had never been recovered, presumably hidden in the caches mentioned in the 17th ledger, locations described in code that researchers have still not fully deciphered. Perhaps most significantly, the additional records suggested that the brothers' operation had inspired imitators. Ezekiel had documented correspondence with at least 7 other individuals or groups who had established similar operations in other isolated communities across the Appalachian region, seeking his advice on preservation techniques and transportation arrangements. "Our methods have created a new industry that will persist even if we do not," Ezekiel wrote in 1818. "The demand for medical science is insatiable, and we have demonstrated how effectively this demand can be met by those with sufficient resolve and ingenuity. I have shared our techniques selectively with individuals who show proper appreciation for the necessary discretion." This revelation raised a disturbing possibility that the Ashworth's approach to supplying cadavers through strategic murder might have influenced body procurement practices throughout the eastern United States during the 19th century. Medical historians now suggest that the unusual consistency in preservation methods observed in anatomical specimens from this period may indicate a standardized approach passed down from the Ashworths to their disciples. The final pages of the 17th ledger contain what appears to be the brothers' contingency plan, detailed instructions for establishing new identities in Missouri Territory, including contacts who would vouch for them, properties purchased under assumed names, and strategies for introducing themselves to new communities. "We will begin again, wiser for this experience," Ezekiel wrote in what appears to be his final entry before their flight. Zechariah suggests we operate independently henceforth, maintaining connection only through our established courier network. One man raising no suspicion where three might. The work continues, though our methods must evolve. Historical researchers have attempted to trace the brothers' movements using these plans, but the trail goes cold at the Mississippi River. Records suggest individuals matching their descriptions may have traveled on riverboats bound for St. Louis in early 1822, but confirmation of their ultimate fate remains elusive nearly 2 centuries later. Elizabeth Caldwell, whose persistence had exposed the brothers' crimes, remained in Kentucky after the investigation. Using a portion of her husband's estate, she established a small school in Lexington that eventually evolved into one of the state's respected academies. She never remarried, devoting herself instead to educational reform and later in life to advocacy for improved oversight of medical education and anatomical study. In 1860, nearly 4 decades after the Ashworth case, Elizabeth gave a rare interview to the Louisville Courier, reflecting on the events that had defined her life's trajectory. "People often ask if I am proud of uncovering such evil," she said. "I feel no pride, only a deep sadness that my James and hundreds of others were sacrificed on the altar of medical progress. If there is any consolation, it is that their deaths eventually led to reforms that prevented countless similar atrocities." The Ashworths exposed a terrible truth about how our society valued certain lives less than others, particularly those without wealth or connections. I hope we have learned something from that revelation, though I fear human nature changes slowly, if at all. The story of the Ashworth brothers serves as a chilling reminder of how trusted institutions and respected individuals can conceal unimaginable evil. The brothers maintained their facade of respectability for nearly 4 decades, using the community's trust and the isolation of the frontier to conduct one of history's most extensive murder enterprises. Their story also highlights the ethical compromises that accompanied early medical advancement in America, how the desperate need for anatomical knowledge created conditions where those willing to supply cadavers without questions asked could profit enormously, regardless of their methods. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that the brothers escaped justice entirely, potentially establishing new identities and continuing their practices elsewhere. The 17th ledger's reference to disciples trained in their methods suggests their influence may have extended far beyond their own direct actions, creating a legacy of exploitation that persisted throughout the 19th century. As you read this account of the Ashworth brothers and their crimes, consider this: how many other historical horrors remain buried in forgotten records and abandoned cemeteries? How many other trusted community figures throughout history have concealed similar dark enterprises behind facades of respectability? The story of Death Valley Cemetery reminds us that history's darkest chapters often lie just beneath the surface of the official narrative, waiting for someone persistent enough to uncover them. Now that you've heard this disturbing piece of forgotten American history, we hope you'll join our community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to look into the darkest corners of our past. Subscribe to our channel for more meticulously researched historical horror stories that mainstream historians often overlook. Hit the notification bell to make sure you never miss our weekly uploads, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Ashworth brothers' crimes. What other historical mysteries would you like us to investigate next? Remember, the truth is often more terrifying than fiction, especially when it's been buried for centuries.